Sometimes a man rides into town carrying more than just the dust of a long trail. Sometimes he's carrying the weight of choices that changed everything, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he can still make things right. When Caleb Rye arrived in Sundown Ridge, he met Loretta Vale, a widow defending her ranch with nothing but a rifle and fierce determination. She thought he was trouble sent by men who wanted her land. Instead of drawing his gun, he offered his help. What started as distrust slowly became something neither expected. But would a man running from his past find the courage to fight for a future worth keeping? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Sundown Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty main street, where weathered buildings stood like old soldiers at attention. This was a town that had seen better days, when the railroad was supposed to come through, and cattle drives were common as summer rain. Now, with the tracks laid 50 miles north and the herds following different routes, Sundown Ridge felt like a forgotten page in someone else's story. Caleb Rye dismounted his bay gelding outside Henderson's general store, his travel-worn saddlebags heavy with the accumulated weight of 6 years on the trail. The leather was cracked and faded, held together by careful stitching and stubborn hope. Inside those bags lay the remnants of a life he'd once known, a tin-type photograph wrapped in oilcloth, a few letters never sent, and a silver pocket watch that had stopped working somewhere outside Dodge City. The horse nickered softly, and Caleb ran a gentle hand along its neck. "Easy, boy. We'll get you some grain and water soon enough." His voice carried the gravelly tone of a man who'd spent more time talking to his horse than to people in recent years. Through the store's dusty window, he caught sight of a woman behind the counter. Mrs. Henderson, most likely, with her graying hair pinned back and spectacles perched on her nose. She glanced up from her ledger, and their eyes met briefly before she looked away. Strangers weren't uncommon in Sundown Ridge, but they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms either. The bell above the door chimed as Caleb stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee, tobacco, and dry goods greeting him. Mrs. Henderson looked up again, this time with the practiced smile of a shopkeeper. "Afternoon," she said, her voice cautious but polite. "Can I help you find something?" "Just need some supplies," Caleb replied, tipping his hat, "and wondering if you might know of any work around these parts. I'm handy with tools, good with horses." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a moment, taking in his worn but clean clothes, the careful way he held himself, the absence of the swagger that usually marked troublemakers. "Work's scarce around here, mister. Most folks are just trying to hold on to what they have." "Understood." Caleb began selecting items from the shelf's: coffee, beans, hardtack. "Mind if I ask what's got everyone so spooked? Town feels like it's holding its breath." The woman's expression darkened. "The Klein's brothers have been making things difficult for the smaller ranchers. Buying up land, sometimes using methods that ain't exactly neighborly." She paused, then added quietly, "There's a woman about 3 miles south of here, Loretta Vale. She's been having the worst of it." Caleb's hands stilled on a can of peaches. "What kind of trouble?" "Lost her husband 3 years back. Been trying to keep the ranch running by herself ever since. The Klein's boys want her landsits right between their spread and the river. They've been pressuring her to sell, but she won't budge." "Good for her," Caleb said, and meant it. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice. Could use some help, but she's proud, doesn't take kindly to charity or pity." 20 minutes later, Caleb was riding south on the wagon road, the late afternoon sun warming his back. The landscape here was different from the harsh desert he'd crossed, gentler somehow, with rolling hills dotted with oak trees and grass that still held traces of green despite the summer heat. This was good ranching country, the kind of place where a man could build something lasting if he had the mind to. The Vale Ranch came into view as he crested a small hill. It was modest but well-maintained, with a whitewashed house, a solid barn, and corrals that spoke of careful craftsmanship. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, their red hides gleaming in the afternoon light, but there were fewer than there should have been for a spread this size. He was still a quarter-mile from the house when he heard the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet kicked up dust 10 feet in front of his horse, and Caleb reined in immediately, raising his hands. "That's far enough, stranger." The voice was clear and strong, distinctly feminine, but hard as iron. "State your business." Caleb looked toward the house and saw her, on the front porch, a woman in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a blue work dress and holding a Winchester rifle with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Even at this distance, he could see the determined set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a soldier at her post. "Name's Caleb Rye," he called back, keeping his hands visible. "Mrs. Henderson in town mentioned you might have work for a man who's good with his hands." "Mrs. Henderson talks too much," the woman replied, but she lowered the rifle slightly. "And I didn't ask for help." "No, ma'am, I expect you didn't. But I'm asking for work, and I'm willing to earn it fair and square." Loretta Vale, for this had to be her, studied him for a long moment. She'd learned to read men quickly since Thomas died, to spot the ones who meant trouble before they got too close. This one was different, though. He sat his horse like a man comfortable with himself, not like someone looking for a fight or an easy mark. "What makes you think I need help?" she asked. "Well, ma'am, I passed some fence line on the way in that's been cut. Saw cattle tracks heading toward the river, but the grass near the fence is trampled like someone drove them through on purpose. And there's smoke over yonder that looks like it's coming from burned fence posts." Loretta's grip tightened on the rifle. This stranger was observant. She'd give him that. Too observant, maybe. "You seem to notice a lot for someone just passing through." "I notice what I need to notice," Caleb said simply. "And right now I need work. I'm good with tools, better with horses, and I know how to keep my mouth shut about things that aren't my business." "Draw your gun, stranger," Loretta said suddenly, her voice steady as iron. Caleb blinked, surprised. "Ma'am? I said draw your gun. I want to see what kind of man you are." Instead of reaching for the Colt at his hip, Caleb slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. "I'm the kind of man who doesn't draw on a woman defending her home," he said, "and I'm the kind who's tired of solving problems with bullets." Something shifted in Loretta's expression, a softening around her eyes that she quickly suppressed. "Could be a trick," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Could be," Caleb agreed, "but it's not." A meadowlark called from somewhere in the distance, and the evening breeze carried the scent of grass and wildflowers. Loretta found herself studying this stranger more carefully, the way he sat quietly, waiting for her decision, the genuine weariness in his eyes, the careful way he'd handled her test. "I can pay $20 a month and found," she said finally. "Bunkhouse is clean, meals are plain but regular, work starts at dawn." "That's more than fair," Caleb said, dismounting to retrieve his gun belt. "I'm obliged." "Don't be obliged yet," Loretta warned, stepping down from the porch. "The Klein's brothers have been making life difficult around here. Working for me might mean more trouble than you're looking for." Caleb settled his gun belt back around his waist and looked at her directly. "Ma'am, I've been running from trouble for 6 years. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started standing my ground." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Loretta Vale felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Not the desperate kind that clutched at straws, but the steady, careful hope of someone who'd been alone too long and might have found an ally. She wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck now, tucked beneath her dress where it rested close to her heart. Thomas had been gone 3 years, but she'd kept it there as a reminder of what she'd lost and a promise to herself that she'd never be that vulnerable again. As she watched Caleb Rye lead his horse toward the barn, she touched the ring through the fabric of her dress and wondered if holding on to the past was worth the loneliness of the present. The evening was settling in around them, and there was work to be done. But for the first time in months, Loretta didn't feel like she was facing it alone. Caleb was mending fence at first light when he found the first burned post. The morning air still held the night's coolness, and dew clung to the grass like scattered diamonds. He'd been working since dawn, replacing the wire that had been cut during the night when the acrid smell of charred wood reached his nostrils. The fence post stood like a blackened finger against the pale sky, deliberately burned, but left standing as a message. Around its base, the grass had been trampled by several horses, and bootprints in the soft earth told the story of men who'd taken their time with their destruction. Sons of... Caleb caught himself, glancing toward the house where Loretta was hanging laundry on the line. She moved with efficient grace, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the hills where riders might appear. He followed the fence line north and found 2 more burned posts, each one a deliberate act of intimidation. But it was what he discovered near the creek that made his blood run cold. 3 head of cattle lay in the shallow water, their throats cut, the water below them stained dark. They'd been Loretta's best breeding stock, he could tell by their size and the care that had gone into their raising. The waste of it filled him with a familiar anger, the kind that had gotten him into trouble before. But this wasn't about him. This was about a woman trying to hold on to the life she'd built with her husband, and men who thought they could take it away through fear and violence. Dear God, Loretta's voice came from behind him, quiet and horrified. Caleb turned to find her standing at the creek's edge, her face pale but her jaw set with determination. She'd traded her work dress for riding clothes, practical pants, and a man's shirt that had probably belonged to her late husband. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. 3. Your best breeders, looks like." Loretta nodded, as if she'd expected as much. "They know what they're doing. Every cow they kill, every fence they burn, costs me money I don't have to spare." She knelt by the water, her hand trailing in the current downstream from the dead cattle. "Thomas used to say the land would provide for us as long as we took care of it. He never imagined men like the Kleins." "Tell me about them," Caleb said, settling into a crouch beside her. "Marcus and Jonas Kleins came here 5 years ago with money from back east and big plans. They've been buying up every spread they can get their hands on, and when folks won't sell," she gestured toward the dead cattle, "this law won't help." Loretta's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Morrison owes the bank money, and the bank's owned by the Kleins. Besides, they're careful, never leave enough evidence to make charges stick." Caleb studied the scene again, noting details that painted a clearer picture. 4 riders, maybe 5. They came from the north, worked their way along the fence line. Took their time about it. This wasn't random vandalism. This was planned. "You read sign well for a drifter," Loretta observed. "A man picks up skills when he needs them." They worked together through the morning, dragging the dead cattle away from the creek and burying them in a grove of cottonwoods. It was hard, dirty work, and by the time they finished, the sun was high overhead and both of them were covered in sweat and mud. As they walked back toward the house, Loretta suddenly stopped. "Riders coming," she said, pointing toward the east. 3 men approached at an easy lope, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. Even at a distance, Caleb could see they rode like men who owned the world and everything in it. The leader was a big man with silver-streaked hair and clothes that cost more than most people saw in a year. The 2 behind him wore the look of hired gunshot men, with careful eyes and hands that rested easy near their weapons. "Marcus Kleins," Loretta said, her voice flat, "right on schedule." They reached the yard as the riders reined in near the porch. Marcus Kleins dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his pale eyes taking in the scene with calculating interest. His gaze lingered on Caleb for a moment, before focusing on Loretta. "Miss Vale," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to seem both polite and mocking. "I heard you had some trouble with your stock." "Nothing I can't handle," Loretta replied, her hand resting casually near the rifle leaning against the porch rail. "I'm sure you can't," Klein said with false sympathy. "These are dangerous times for a woman trying to run a ranch alone. Wolves, rustlers, all manner of threats." His eyes flicked to Caleb again. "Though I see you've hired some help." "That's right," Loretta said. "Caleb Rye, meet Marcus Kleins." Kleins stepped forward, extending his hand with the confidence of a man used to having his gestures returned. Caleb looked at the offered hand for a long moment before accepting it. The rancher's grip was firm, testing, the handshake of a man trying to take the measure of another. "Rye," Klein said thoughtfully. "Can't say I know the name. You from around these parts?" "Here and there," Caleb replied evenly. One of the gunmen shifted in his saddle, and Caleb caught the movement, without seeming to look. Professional habits died hard. "Well," Klein's continued, releasing Caleb's hand, "I hope Miss Vale's been clear about the situation here. This can be a dangerous country for folks who don't understand the way things work." "Seems straightforward enough to me," Caleb said. "A woman's trying to run her ranch, and some people want to make that difficult for her." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop several degrees. Klein's smile never wavered, but something cold and predatory flickered in his eyes. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "I'm here as a neighbor, offering assistance. Miss Vale knows I've made a more than generous offer for this property." "And Miss Vale's made it clear she's not interested in selling," Caleb replied. "Things change," one of the gunmen said from his saddle. "Sometimes what looks like a good idea today don't look so smart tomorrow." Caleb's hand dropped to his side, not quite touching his gun, but close enough to matter. The movement was casual, natural, but the gunman's eyes narrowed with recognition. This was no ordinary ranch hand. "Gentlemen," Loretta said, stepping between them, "I think we're all clear on where everyone stands. Mr. Kleins, I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, I'm managing just fine." Klein studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Of course you are, but the offer stands, Miss Vale, and I should mention there are legal matters that might require your attention soon. Questions about property lines, water rights, that sort of thing. It would be a shame if you found yourself in court over technical difficulties." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Kleins?" "Threatening?" Kleins looked genuinely shocked. "My dear woman, I'm trying to help you. But sometimes the law has its own concerns, regardless of our personal wishes." He remounted his horse with the same fluid grace, his men falling into formation behind him. "Miss Vale, Mr. Rye, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." They rode away at the same easy pace, but Caleb noticed how the gunmen kept glancing back, their hands never far from their weapons. "Well," Loretta said when they were out of earshot, "now you know what you've gotten yourself into." Caleb watched the riders disappear over the hill. "Seems to me I've gotten myself into helping a good woman keep what's rightfully hers." "This isn't your fight, Caleb. You could still ride out, find work somewhere safer." He turned to look at her, seeing the strength in her green eyes, the way she held herself ready for whatever came next. "Could," he agreed, "but I won't." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, maybe, or a promise. The burned fence posts stood as stark reminders of the cost of defiance, but neither of them looked away. The war for the Vale Ranch had begun in earnest. The evening shadows were growing long when Caleb finished replacing the last section of cut fence. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands bore fresh calluses from the wirework, but the fence line stood straight and strong again. For now. As he gathered his tools, he caught sight of something glinting in the dirt near one of the new posts. Kneeling down, he brushed away the earth to reveal a spent cartridge case, .44 caliber, relatively fresh. He pocketed it without thinking, the old habits of reading sign and preserving evidence coming back like muscle memory. Near the bunkhouse, beneath a gnarled oak tree where the ground stayed soft even in dry weather, Caleb knelt and began digging with his hands. The hole didn't need to be deep, just enough to keep his past buried where it belonged. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloths, Colt 45, the one that had earned him both fame and infamy in another life. The weight of it felt familiar and terrible in his hands. 6 years he'd carried this gun without drawing it in anger. 6 years of running from the man he'd been, trying to become someone better. But looking at those burned fence posts, seeing the pain in Loretta's eyes when she'd found her dead cattle, he wondered if a man could ever truly escape what he was. He wrapped the gun carefully and lowered it into the hole, then covered it with earth and scattered leaves. Some things were better left buried. "Caleb?" Loretta's voice carried across the yard from the house. "Supper's ready." The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of cornbread and beef stew. Loretta had set 2 places at the small wooden table, and she'd changed from her work clothes into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, filling bowls and cutting bread. But Caleb sensed a nervousness in her movements. "Smells wonderful," he said, settling into the chair she indicated. "It's nothing fancy. Thomas always said I was a better rancher than I was a cook, but I manage." They ate in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Finally, Loretta set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "You handled yourself well today with Klein's. Most men would have either backed down or started shooting. Neither one would have helped you much." "No, I suppose not." She paused, studying his face in the lamplight. "But you're not most men, are you? The way you read those tracks this morning, how you spotted that rifle cartridge you thought I didn't see you pick up, that's not something you learn mending fences." Caleb took a careful sip of coffee, buying time to think. "A man picks up skills where he can." "That's the second time you've said that. What kind of skills are we talking about, Caleb?" He met her eyes, seeing the intelligence there, the way she was putting pieces together. Loretta Vale was nobody's fool, and he'd been foolish to think he could hide what he was indefinitely. "The kind that might help keep your ranch," he said finally. "And the kind that might bring trouble down on both our heads?" "That too." Loretta nodded slowly, as if his honesty had settled something in her mind. Thomas was a good man, but he was gentle. He believed people were basically decent, that problems could be solved with hard work and fair dealing. She touched the chain around her neck, where her wedding ring rested. "The Klein's brothers taught me different." "What happened to him, your husband?" "Accident with a spooked horse. At least, that's what Sheriff Morrison called it." Her voice carried a bitterness that made Caleb look up sharply. "Thomas was the best rider in 3 counties. Had a way with horses that was almost magical. But Morrison said the horse must have stepped in a prairie dog hole, threw Thomas against a rock." "But you don't believe that?" "The horse came home without a scratch, and Thomas was found 2 miles from any prairie dog town." She stood abruptly, beginning to clear the dishes. "But there was no proof, no witnesses, just a grieving widow's suspicions." Caleb helped her with the dishes, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she kept her emotions in check. "How long after that did the Kleins start pressuring you to sell?" "About 6 months. Said they understood my grief, but a woman alone couldn't manage a spread this size. They were very sympathetic." "I bet they were." As they finished cleaning up, Loretta moved to the window and gazed out at the darkening landscape. "Some nights I stand here and remember how it used to be. Thomas and I would sit on the porch after supper, planning improvements, talking about the future. We were going to have children, expand the herd, maybe build a new barn." She turned back to him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Now I just try to make it through each day without losing any more." "You're stronger than you know," Caleb said quietly. "Am I? Some days I wonder if I'm just being stubborn. The money Klein's offered would be enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere safer. But this is your home. This is Thomas's dream. I'm not sure it was ever really mine." Caleb moved to stand beside her at the window. In the distance, he could see lights from the Klein's ranch, bright and defiant against the darkness. "What would be your dream?" Loretta was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to teach school back in Missouri, before I married Thomas. I loved it watching children learn, seeing their faces light up when they understood something new. There are children around here who've never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. Why don't you teach them?" "Where? The nearest school is 30 miles away, and most families can't spare their children for that long. Besides, I can barely keep this ranch running. People have been known to build schools, hire teachers." She laughed, but there was sadness in it. "That takes money and time, neither of which I have in abundance." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Caleb found himself studying her profile in the lamplight, noting the determined set of her chin, the way her hair caught the golden glow. She was beautiful, but it was her strength that drew him, the quiet courage she showed in the face of overwhelming odds. "Caleb," her voice was soft, uncertain. "Why did you really stay? When I offered you work, you could have ridden on to the next town, found employment somewhere safer." He considered the question, thinking about the buried gun under the oak tree, about 6 years of running from his past and himself. "Maybe I got tired of running." Running from what? Mistakes, bad choices, the man I used to be. She turned to face him fully, her green eyes searching his face. "And what kind of man do you want to be? The kind who stands up for what's right. The kind who doesn't run when people need help, even if it's dangerous." Especially then. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared purpose and growing trust. Loretta reached up and touched his arm, her fingers light against his sleeve. "Thank you," she said simply, "for staying, for helping, for not treating me like I'm helpless. You're about as far from helpless as anyone I've ever met." Outside, a coyote called from the hills, its voice lonely and wild in the darkness. But inside the warm kitchen, 2 people who had been alone too long found themselves no longer quite so isolated. 3 days later, Loretta found Caleb in the barn, carefully examining a legal document by the light of the oil lamp. His brow was furrowed with concentration, and she could see the tension in his shoulders as he read. "Bad news?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. He looked up, holding out the papers. "Sheriff Morrison brought this by while you were in town. Legal notice about a boundary dispute. Seems the Kleins are claiming your eastern pasture based on some old survey." Loretta took the document, her heart sinking as she scanned the official language. "This is the land Thomas bought from the Patterson family before we married. We have the deed. They're not disputing your ownership of that land. They're claiming the original survey was wrong, that your fence line is 300 yards over onto their property. That's impossible. Thomas and I walked every inch of this ranch with the original surveyor. We know exactly where the boundaries are." Caleb pointed to a particular section of the document. "They've got a new survey, done by a man named Hutchins from Denver. According to this, you owe them 3 years of back rent on the grazing land, plus damages for the fencing." The paper trembled slightly in Loretta's hands. "How much?" "Near about $1,200. The number hit her like a physical blow. $1,200 was more than the ranch made in 2 good years. It might as well have been 12,000. "They're trying to force me into bankruptcy," she said quietly. "Even if I could prove they're wrong, I can't afford the legal fees to fight it." "There's another way to look at this." Caleb moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the barn, lifting the lid to reveal neat stacks of ranch records. "Your husband kept good books." Thomas was meticulous about record-keeping. Said a rancher who didn't know his numbers was a rancher headed for trouble. Caleb pulled out a leather-bound ledger and several rolled documents. "These are the original deeds and surveys. If we can prove the new survey is fraudulent." "With what? The Kleins have money for lawyers, expert witnesses, whatever it takes. I have good intentions and empty pockets." As Loretta spoke, she pulled out one particular document, the original ranch deed, signed by Thomas Vale and witnessed by the Territorial Land Office. It was written in careful script on heavy paper, and it bore the official seal of the territory. But as she unrolled it fully, something caught her eye. "Caleb, look at this." She pointed to a section of the deed near the bottom. "There's a clause here I'd forgotten about. It says the property includes water and mineral rights to everything within the surveyed boundaries, but also," she paused, reading more carefully, "it also grants rights to any water source that originates on the property, regardless of where it flows." Caleb leaned in to read over her shoulder, and she was suddenly aware of his closeness, the warmth of his presence. "The creek that runs through your east pasture, where does it start?" "There's a spring about a mile upstream, right in the middle of what they're claiming is their land." But according to this deed, if the spring is on my property, I have rights to the entire creek. And if the Kleins have been using that water for their cattle, they'd be trespassing. Loretta felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. Thomas always said that spring was the most valuable thing on this ranch. The creek never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through Thomas's papers, building a case based on the original surveys and water rights. As they worked, Loretta found herself stealing glances at Caleb, noting the careful way he handled the documents, his obvious familiarity with legal language. "You read these papers like a man who's dealt with lawyers before," she observed. "Like I said, a man picks up skills where he can," she finished with a slight smile. "You've used that line enough times that I'm starting to think it means more than you're letting on." Caleb was quiet for a moment, organizing a stack of receipts with unnecessary care. "I wasn't always a ranch hand, Loretta. Had a different kind of life before I started drifting." "What kind of life?" "The kind that taught me to read legal documents and spot a fraudulent survey from 50 yards away." Before she could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the barn door, they could see Sheriff Morrison riding up the lane with 2 other men wearing a badge that marked him as a deputy, the other in the expensive clothes of a territorial official. "Miss Vale," Morrison called as he dismounted, "got some business to discuss with you." They walked out to meet the men, Loretta carrying the deed and original surveys. The territorial official, a thin man with calculating eyes, introduced himself as Hutchins, the same surveyor whose work had disputed their boundaries. "Miss Vale," Hutchins said with false sympathy, "I understand you've received notice of the boundary adjustment. I'm here to make sure you understand the legal implications." "I understand them just fine," Loretta replied, holding up the original deed. "What I don't understand is how your survey can contradict documents that were filed with the Territorial Land Office and witnessed by federal officials." Hutchins barely glanced at the papers. "Surveying techniques have improved considerably since then, Miss Vale. We have more accurate instruments now, better methods." "Accurate enough to move a property line 300 yards?" Caleb asked quietly. The surveyor's eyes flicked to Caleb with sudden interest. "And you are? Someone who's wondering how a spring that's been on Vale property for 20 years suddenly ended up on Klein's land." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I mean," Caleb continued, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, "that water rights in this territory follow very specific laws. If Miss Vale can prove that spring originates on her land, she has legal claim to the entire waterway, including the portions the Kleins have been using for their stock." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Now, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Seems to me it's already plenty complicated," Loretta said. "Mr. Hutchins, I'd like to see your surveying notes and the instruments you used for your measurements." "That's proprietary information." "It's evidence in a legal dispute," Caleb interrupted, "and any surveyor worth his salt would be happy to show his work." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Hutchins cleared his throat. "Of course, there may be room for negotiation. The Kleins are reasonable men. Perhaps we could reach an accommodation that benefits everyone." "What kind of accommodation?" Loretta asked. "A partnership, perhaps. The Kleins provide the capital to develop the land properly. You provide the water rights. Everyone profits." "Everyone except the woman who loses her ranch," Caleb said. Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Mr. Rye, isn't it? I'd be careful about making accusations I couldn't back up. I'd be careful about threatening law-abiding citizens, Sheriff." The tension in the yard ratcheted up several degrees. Loretta could see the calculation in the men's eyes, the way they were measuring Caleb, trying to decide how dangerous he might be. "Gentlemen," she said firmly, "I think we've said all that needs saying for now. I'll need time to review these documents with my own legal counsel." "Of course," Hutchins said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But don't take too long, Miss Vale. Legal matters have a way of becoming more expensive the longer they drag on." As the 3 men rode away, Loretta felt the weight of the fight ahead settling on her shoulders. But when she looked at Caleb, she saw something that gave her courage a man who wasn't backing down, who was ready to stand and fight for what was right. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting them intimidate me. For knowing about water rights and fraudulent surveys. For being here." He looked down at her, and for a moment she thought he might say something important, something that would change everything between them. Instead, he just nodded. "We'll figure this out, Loretta, I promise." In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising rain before morning. But for now, the two of them stood together in the growing darkness, ready to face whatever came next. The storm came before dawn, hammering the ranch with rain that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. Caleb lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the thunder roll across the valley and thinking about the weight of secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He'd been here 2 weeks now, long enough to see the pattern of Loretta's day sup before sunrise to tend the animals, working until her hands were raw and her back ached, falling into bed, exhausted only to wake and do it all again. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but he could see the toll the constant pressure was taking. When the rain finally stopped and he emerged from the bunkhouse, he found her in the barn, doctoring a cut on one of the horses. She looked up as he approached, and he saw something different in her eyes, wariness that hadn't been there before. "Morning," he said, settling into a crouch beside her to examine the horse's leg. "Morning." Her voice was carefully neutral. Storm brought down some branches. One of them must have caught Buttercup here. As she worked, Caleb noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not from the cold or exhaustion, but from something else entirely, fear maybe, or the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. "Loretta," he said gently. "What is it?" She finished bandaging the horse's leg before answering. When she finally looked at him, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I went through Thomas's things last night, really went through them, looking for anything that might help with this boundary dispute." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I found something I wasn't supposed to find." From her pocket, she pulled a small silver locket, tarnished with age and worn smooth by handling. She opened it to reveal a photograph of a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with Caleb's dark hair and serious eyes. The world seemed to stop. Caleb stared at the photograph, his chest tightening with a familiar pain that he'd thought buried deep enough to stay hidden. His son, his boy, who would have been 12 now, if not for the fever that took him 6 years ago. "Where did you find this?" he managed to ask. "It was in your saddlebags. They fell over during the storm, and things scattered." Loretta's voice was gentle but probing. "Who is he, Caleb?" For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The memories came flooding back: Sarah's laughter, little David's excited chatter about becoming a rancher like his pa, the terrible silence that fell over their small house when the fever came. The accusations that followed, the trial that destroyed everything he'd ever cared about. "His name was David," Caleb said finally. "He was my son." "Was?" "Died 6 years ago. Fever took him and his mother both." Loretta's expression softened with understanding and sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine." She stopped, studying his face more carefully. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Caleb took the locket from her hands, his fingers tracing the worn silver. "No, it's not." "Tell me." He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We had a small place outside Abilene. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. I was trying to build something good, something clean. But the past has a way of catching up to a man." He closed the locket and handed it back to her. "There was a dispute with a neighbor, a man named Carlton, who claimed I'd stolen some of his cattle. When David and Sarah got sick, Carlton spread word that it was God's judgment on a thief." "But you hadn't stolen anything." "No, but I'd done other things, things that made people ready to believe the worst about me." He stood and walked to the barn door, staring out at the rain-washed landscape. "When they died, Carlton pushed harder, got the sheriff to bring charges, said I'd been rustling to pay for medicine that didn't work anyway." Loretta moved to stand beside him, the locket still clasped in her hands. "What happened?" Trial was a foregone conclusion. Small town, and Carlton had money and influence. I had a reputation and dead family. His voice hardened. Night before the verdict was supposed to come down, I left. Been running ever since. You were innocent. Was I? He turned to look at her, and she saw the self-doubt that had been eating at him for 6 years. Maybe if I'd been a different kind of man, a better man, David and Sarah would still be alive. Maybe Carlton was right about God's judgment. That's not how God works. Loretta said firmly, "Sickness isn't punishment, Caleb. It's just sickness. And losing someone you love doesn't make you guilty of anything except caring too much." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to wonder if you could have done something different, something better. But running from the pain doesn't make it go away. It just makes you lonelier. Loretta, I've been watching you these past weeks. The way you work, the way you treat the animals, the way you've stood up for me against the Kleins. That's not the behavior of a bad man. That's the behavior of someone who's been hurt and is trying to find his way back to being whole." They stood close together in the doorway, and Caleb found himself memorizing the details of her face, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident, the way her hair caught the morning light, the absolute conviction in her eyes when she spoke about his character. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I think you've been carrying this alone for too long, and because—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "Because I care what happens to you." Before he could respond, she reached up and kissed him, soft and gentle and full of understanding. It was the first time in 6 years that anyone had touched him with tenderness instead of fear or suspicion, and the feeling nearly overwhelmed him. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, and he could feel her trembling. "I wasn't looking for this," she whispered. "After Thomas died, I thought I was done with caring about anyone that way. And now I'm terrified. Because caring about someone means you can lose them, and I don't think I could survive that again." Caleb wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, while the morning sun struggled to break through the clouds. He thought about the gun buried under the oak tree, about the wanted posters that might still bear his name, about all the reasons why loving him could only bring her pain. But he also thought about the way she'd looked at the photograph of his sonnet, with judgment or fear, but with compassion. About how she'd stood up to the Klein's brothers, how she'd refused to give up on her dreams, even when everything seemed hopeless. "Loretta," he said into her hair, "there are things about my past, about who I am, that could bring you trouble." "I know," she replied, "but some things are worth the risk." Outside, the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, casting golden light across the rain-washed land. And for the first time in 6 years, Caleb Rye began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could stop running and start building something good again. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a boy from town who wouldn't meet their eyes as he handed over the envelope. Loretta's name was written across the front in bold, confident script, and the paper was expensive, the kind that spoke of money and power. She opened it while Caleb watched from the porch steps, his coffee growing cold in his hands. As she read, he saw her face go pale, then flush with anger. "What is it?" he asked, though the tight set of her shoulders already told him it was nothing good. Without a word, she handed him the letter. The message was brief and to the point. "Miss Vale, this serves as final notice regarding the boundary dispute on your eastern section. You have 48 hours to vacate the contested land and remove all livestock, or face the consequences of continued trespass. Be advised that we have the full backing of territorial law in this matter. We remain hopeful that you will see reason and accept our generous offer to purchase your property at fair market value. Time, however, is not on your side. Respectfully, Marcus Kleins." Caleb folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. 48 hours. To give up 300 acres of the best grazing land on the ranch. Loretta's voice was steady, but he could hear the fury underneath. "Without that pasture, I can't support enough cattle to make the ranch profitable. They know exactly what they're doing. We need to see that spring. What? The water source you mentioned. If we can prove it originates on your land, it changes everything. Caleb stood, his decision made. Get your rifle and some supplies. We're going to take a ride. An hour later, they were following the creek upstream, their horses picking their way carefully along the rocky bank. The water ran clear and cold, and Caleb could see why it was so valuable in this dry country. A reliable water source was worth more than gold to a rancher. As they rode, Loretta pointed out landmarks, the old line shack where she and Thomas used to shelter during roundups, the grove of cottonwoods where they'd had their first kiss, the rocky outcrop that marked the original boundary of their land. There, she said finally, pointing ahead to where the creek emerged from a cluster of boulders. That's the spring. They dismounted and approached on foot. The spring was more impressive than Caleb had expected. A clear pool, maybe 10 feet across, fed by an underground source that bubbled up through a crack in the bedrock. The water was so clear he could see all the way to the bottom, where small fish darted between the rocks. Beautiful, he said, kneeling beside the pool. Thomas used to say this was the heart of the ranch. Everything else grew out from here. Loretta's voice carried a note of reverence. He brought me here the day he proposed, said he wanted to show me where our life together would begin. Caleb pulled out the surveying documents they'd brought, comparing the legal descriptions to the actual landscape. According to the original survey, the spring was clearly on Vale property, almost a quarter-mile inside the boundary line. The Klein's new survey puts this spring on their land, he said, studying the papers. But look at this. He pointed to a notation on Hutchins' map. He's moved the entire eastern boundary about 300 yards west. Is that even possible? I mean legally. Not without cause. Boundaries can be adjusted for errors in the original survey, but there has to be compelling evidence. Caleb looked around at the spring, noting details that told a different story. Loretta, look at those stone markers. She followed his gaze to where several weathered stone cairns marked the landscape. The stones were old, covered with lichen and worn by years of weather, and they formed a clear line that ran well east of where the Kleins claimed the boundary should be. Thomas and I built those markers ourselves, using the original survey as a guide, she said. We were meticulous about it, measured everything twice. And they've been here for how long? 8 years, at least. Caleb nodded grimly. Hutchins would have had to ignore physical evidence that's been in place for nearly a decade. That's not surveying, that's fraud. A sound from behind them made both of them turn. 4 riders were approaching from the direction of the Klein's ranch, and even at a distance, Caleb could see they weren't coming for a friendly chat. These men rode with the loose, confident posture of professional shired guns who'd found their element. Company, he said quietly. Loretta reached for her rifle, but Caleb caught her wrist gently. Not yet. Let's see what they want. The riders reined in about 20 yards away, close enough to talk but far enough to give themselves room to maneuver. The leader was a lean man with cold eyes and a carefully waxed mustache, the kind of man who killed for money and slept well afterward. Miss Vale, the man said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both polite and threatening. I'm Jake Morrison, foreman for the Klein's ranch. We're here about the trespassing situation. This is my land, Loretta replied firmly. According to our survey, you're about a quarter-mile onto Klein's property. Mr. Marcus wants you to move your stock immediately. And if we don't? Caleb asked. Morrison's eyes flicked to him with interest. Well now, that would be unfortunate. Trespassing cattle have a way of getting themselves lost, if you catch my meaning. I catch it, Caleb said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made the other riders shift nervously in their saddles. Course, accidents happen too, Morrison continued. People get hurt when they don't listen to reason. Be a shame if something happened to a nice lady like Miss Vale. The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Caleb felt the familiar cold settle over him, the same detachment that had once made him dangerous. His hand dropped to his side, not quite touching his gun, but close enough to matter. That sounded like a threat, he said conversationally. Just stating facts, Morrison replied, But Caleb could see the calculation in the man's eyes. He was measuring Caleb, trying to decide how much trouble he might be. "Here's another fact," Caleb said. "This spring has been on Vale property for 8 years. The boundary markers are right there for anyone with eyes to see. Your boss is trying to steal land that doesn't belong to him." Big words from a saddle tramp. "Careful," Caleb warned, and something in his voice made Morrison's hand move closer to his gun. The tension stretched tight as a wire. 4 men against 2, the advantage clearly with the Klein's riders. But there was something about Caleb's stillness, the way he held himself, that gave them pause. Finally, Morrison smiled a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got 48 hours, he said to Loretta. "After that, we start moving trespassing cattle ourselves." They wheeled their horses and rode away, but not before Morrison called back. "Miss Vale, you might want to think real careful about the company you keep. Man can be judged by his associates." When they were out of sight, Loretta let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "They're not going to wait for any legal proceedings, are they?" "No," Caleb said, his eyes still fixed on the direction the riders had gone. "They're going to force you off that land one way or another." "What do we do?" Caleb looked at her, seeing the determination in her face, the way she held her rifle like she knew how to use it. "We prepare for a fight." As they rode back toward the ranch, the afternoon shadows growing long around them, both of them knew that the time for talking was over. The Kleins had made their intentions clear, and now it was only a matter of how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. Behind them, the spring continued to bubble up from the earth, clear and constant, and completely indifferent to the human conflicts that raged around it. But for Caleb and Loretta, it had become the symbol of everything they were fighting for, not just land or water rights, but the chance to build something good in a world that seemed determined to tear it down. The 48 hours passed like a held breath. Caleb spent the time checking weapons, studying the terrain around the ranch, planning defensive positions. But it was what he found in the barn that changed everything. He was moving feed sacks to create a better firing position when one of them tore, spilling oats across the floor. As he knelt to clean up the mess, his hand brushed against something that didn't belong, a piece of paper wedged between 2 floorboards. It was old and yellowed, torn as if it had been ripped from something larger. When he smoothed it out, his blood ran cold. At the top, in faded but unmistakable letters, were the words, "Wanted dead or alive." Below that was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 6 years. Caleb John Mitchell, 2, 0 reward. The rest of the poster was missing, torn away, but he didn't need to see the charges or the description. He knew what it said: murder, robbery, escape from custody. The crimes he'd been accused of after David and Sarah died, the charges that had sent him running into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of rage. But how had this gotten here, and why was only part of it? Finding everything you need? Caleb spun around to find Marcus Klein standing in the barn doorway, flanked by Jake Morrison and 2 other gunmen. The older man's eyes were fixed on the torn poster in Caleb's hands, and his smile was the satisfied expression of a cat who'd finally cornered a particularly troublesome mouse. "Caleb John Mitchell," Kleins said conversationally. "Though I suppose you've been going by Rye for a while now. Clever, changing just the last name. Most men running from the law pick something completely different." Caleb let the paper flutter to the ground, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun before stopping. He was outnumbered 4 to 1, and Loretta was somewhere in the house, unaware of the danger closing around them. "I was wondering when you'd show your hand," he said quietly. "Oh, I've known who you were since the day you rode into town," Kleins replied. "Jake here has quite a memory for faces, don't you, Jake?" Morrison nodded, his hand resting easily on his gun butt. "Saw you in Dodge City, maybe 7 years ago. You were younger then, cleaner, but it's the same face, the same eyes." $2,000 is a considerable sum, Kleins continued. "More than enough to make a man's cooperation worth pursuing. You see, Mr. Mitchell, I don't actually care about Miss Vale's little ranch. It's profitable enough, but hardly essential to my operations." Caleb felt the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You wanted me. I wanted the reputation. The man who shot his way out of 3 different jails, who robbed banks from Kansas to Colorado, who killed how many was it, Jake? 8 men. 9, by the last count, Morrison said, though some of those might have been exaggerated. The point is, Klein said, having a man like Caleb Mitchell working for me would send a very clear message to anyone who might think about opposing my plans in this territory. Fear is a powerful tool, Mr. Mitchell, and you represent fear personified. And if I refuse? Klein shrugged. Then I collect the bounty and find other ways to encourage cooperation, though I must say, having you work for me would be much more profitable in the long run. The barn door opened wider, and another figure stepped into view, Sheriff Morrison, his badge catching the afternoon light. Mr. Mitchell, he said formally, you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and escape from custody. On whose authority? Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. Mine, said a new voice from behind the sheriff. A tall man in a black suit stepped forward, a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. U.S. Marshal Henry Wade, I've been tracking you for 6 years, Mitchell. The trap was complete. Caleb looked around at the faces surrounding him. Klein's with his satisfied smile, Morrison with his professional indifference, the federal marshal with his grim determination. There was no way out that didn't involve bloodshed, and even if he could fight his way clear, they'd only come after Loretta. You orchestrated all of this, he said to Klein's. The boundary dispute, the pressure on Loretta, was all to flush me out. Partly, though I do intend to acquire Miss Vale's property eventually. Water rights are valuable, and I'm not a man to waste opportunities. Klein straightened his coat. But you're correct that the primary goal was to force you into the open. A man on the run can stay hidden indefinitely if he's careful. But a man protecting someone he cares about, well, that changes the equation considerably. Through the barn window, Caleb could see Loretta hanging laundry on the line behind the house, unaware that her world was about to collapse. She'd trusted him, opened her heart to him, and now she was going to discover that everything she thought she knew about him was a lie. The charges against me are quite real, I assure you. Marshal Wade interrupted. 3 banks in Kansas, a stagecoach outside Denver, and the murder of a federal agent during your escape from custody in Colorado Territory. I never killed any federal agent. The evidence suggests otherwise. Caleb felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him for 6 years. But beneath it was something else, cold, calculating calm that he recognized from his darkest days. The part of him that had earned the reputation these men were so eager to exploit. What do you want? He asked. Simple, Klein replied. Work for me. Use that reputation to convince people that cooperation is in their best interests. In return, I'll make sure the federal charges disappear. You can't make federal charges disappear. I can when the key witness has been on my payroll for 2 years, Klein said with a thin smile. Funny how memories can change when properly motivated. Marshal Wade's expression didn't change, but Caleb caught the slight stiffening of his shoulders. Either the marshal was an excellent actor, or he was hearing some of this for the first time. And if I refuse? Then you hang for murder, and Miss Vale loses her ranch anyway. I'm quite patient, Mr. Mitchell. I can wait for her to run out of money fighting legal battles she can't win. The sound of footsteps on the barn floor made everyone turn. Loretta appeared in the doorway, her rifle in her hands, and her face set with determination. Afternoon, gentlemen, she said calmly. I couldn't help but notice we had visitors. Her eyes found Caleb's, and he saw the exact moment she realized something was terribly wrong. The way the men were positioned, the tension in the air, the careful distance everyone was keeping from each other. Loretta, Caleb said quietly, go back to the house. I don't think so. She stepped fully into the barn, the rifle held ready but not quite threatening. Not until someone explains what's going on here. Klein's turned to face her, his expression shifting to one of false sympathy. Miss Vale, I'm afraid there's been a serious deception. The man you know as Caleb Rye is actually a wanted fugitive named Caleb Mitchell. He's been using you to hide from federal authorities." Caleb watched Loretta's face, saw the shock, the disbelief, the slow dawning of understanding. When she looked at him again, her green eyes were filled with questions he didn't know how to answer. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He could have lied, could have denied everything, claimed it was all a mistake or a case of mistaken identity. But looking at her standing there, trusting him even in the face of evidence to the contrary, he couldn't bring himself to add another lie to the mountain of deception he'd already built. "Yes," he said simply, "it's true." The word hung in the air like a gunshot, and Caleb watched something break in Loretta's eyes, not just trust, but hope itself. She'd believed in him, in the possibility of something good growing between them, and he'd let her believe a lie. "The name's different," he continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "But the charges are real. I am a wanted man, Loretta. Everything I told you about David and Sarah, about why I was running, that was true. But the rest of it, you lied to me." "I did." Marshal Wade stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "Mr. Mitchell, you'll need to come with me." But before anyone could move, the barn erupted in gunfire as riders charged into the yard, their weapons blazing. The carefully orchestrated arrest had become a battlefield, and in the chaos that followed, everything Caleb thought he knew about the situation was about to change once again. The gunfire shattered the afternoon, quiet like breaking glass. Caleb threw himself toward Loretta, knocking her behind a pile of feed sacks as bullets whined through the barn. Around them, Klein's men scrambled for cover, their carefully planned arrest dissolving into chaos. Through the barn door, Caleb could see riders wheeling their horses in the yard at least 6 men, maybe more, firing rapidly at anyone who moved. But these weren't more of Klein's hired guns. These men wore the dusty clothes of the trail, and they fought with the desperate fury of men who had nothing left to lose. "Who are they?" Loretta gasped, pressing herself against the feed sacks. Before Caleb could answer, Marshal Wade dove behind a nearby stall, blood streaming from a graze across his forehead. "Jessup gang," he called out grimly. "They must have been tracking Mitchell too." Caleb's blood ran cold. The Jessup brothers, 3 of the most ruthless outlaws in the territory, men who'd made their reputation hunting bounties and settling scores. If they were here, it meant someone had put out word that Caleb Mitchell was in Sundown Ridge. "This is your doing," he said to Klein's, who was crouched behind a water trough, his expensive clothes already stained with dirt and sweat. "I may have mentioned your presence to certain interested parties," Klein's admitted. "Insurance, you might say. If you wouldn't work for me willingly." His words were cut off as another volley of shots peppered the barn. One of Klein's meaner gunmen Caleb didn't recognize cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. "We need to get out of here," Marshal Wade said, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. "There's too many of them." "Where?" Morrison demanded. "They've got the yard covered, and there's no other way out of this barn." Caleb looked around quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. The barn was solid enough to provide cover for now, but if the Jessups decided to burn them out, they'd be dead or captured within minutes. Through the back window, he could see more riders positioning themselves around the ranch buildings. "Loretta," he said, "is there still a root cellar under the house?" "Yes, but does it connect to the old storm cellar by the creek?" Her eyes widened with understanding. "There's a tunnel Thomas dug during the Indian troubles, but it hasn't been used in years. It might be blocked." "It's our only chance." Caleb turned to the others. "We can't fight them here. Too many, and they've got us pinned down." "I'm not running," Wade said firmly. "I have a duty." "Your duty will get us all killed," Caleb interrupted, "including the woman you're supposed to protect." Outside, the gunfire had slackened, and Caleb could hear voices calling back and forth. The Jessups were organizing, planning their next move. It wouldn't be long before they either rushed the barn or tried to smoke them out. "What about the horses?" Loretta asked. Caleb glanced toward the stalls where their mounts were stamping nervously. "We'll have to leave them. Moving on foot is our only option." Mitchell's right, Morrison said grudgingly. We stay here. We're dead. Marshal Wade looked like he wanted to argue, but another burst of gunfire convinced him. All right, but we do this my way. I'm taking Mitchell into custody once we're clear. Assuming we get clear, Caleb muttered. They planned quickly. Caleb would go first, using his knowledge of the terrain to scout the route to the house. The others would follow in pairs, with Loretta staying close to the marshal for protection. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Wait, Loretta said as Caleb prepared to move. She reached under her work dress and pulled out something that made everyone stare, her late husband's Winchester rifle, the one she'd been carrying when he first met her. Thomas always said this rifle never missed what it was aimed at. The weapon was beautiful polished walnut stock, brass fittings, and the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of deep respect for the tool. She checked the action with movements that showed she knew exactly what she was doing. I'm not leaving you to face this alone, she said, meeting Caleb's eyes. Whatever you've done, whatever you are, we're in this together now. Loretta, don't. Her voice was firm, final. I may not understand everything that's happened, but I understand this. Those men out there want to hurt us. That's all I need to know. A new voice called from the yard rough, confident, with the flat accent of the Kansas plains. Mitchell, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and maybe we let the others live. Caleb moved to the window, peering carefully around the frame. In the yard, he could see Tom Jessup, the eldest and most dangerous of the brothers, sitting his horse, like a man born to violence. His face was weathered and scarred, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much killing and enjoyed most of it. What do you want, Jessup? Caleb called back. You know what I want. The price on your head just went up to 3,000. Man could live comfortable on that kind of money. 3,000. Someone wanted him very badly indeed. Caleb glanced at Klein's, whose face had gone pale. I never authorized, Klein's began. No, Marshal Wade said grimly, but I know who did. This has federal money behind it. Someone in Washington wants Mitchell bad enough to triple the bounty. Any idea why? Morrison asked. Wade's silence was answer enough. There were things about Caleb's case that even the marshal didn't know, secrets buried in federal files that might never see daylight. Outside, Tom Jessup was growing impatient. You got 1 minute, Mitchell, then we come in shooting. We need to move now, Caleb said. Loretta, you remember the way to that tunnel? Through the kitchen, down the back stairs, then east about 50 yards to the old cellar door. Good. Wade, you and Morrison take point. Klein's, you stay between them and Loretta. I'll bring up the rear. I should, Loretta began. You should stay alive, Caleb said firmly. That rifle won't do any good if you're dead. They moved in a tight group toward the barn's back door, stepping carefully to avoid the creaking boards that might give them away. Outside, Caleb could hear the Jessups moving around the building, but they seemed to be concentrating on the front entrance. The run to the house was 20 yards of open ground, 20 yards where they'd be completely exposed if anyone spotted them. Wade went first, sprinting low and fast toward the kitchen door. He made it without incident, gesturing for the others to follow. Morrison went next, then Klein's, his expensive clothes making him look absurdly out of place in the desperate flight. Both men reached the house safely, but as Loretta prepared to run, a shout went up from the yard. There, by the house. Gunfire erupted again, bullets chewing splinters from the house's wooden siding. Loretta froze in the doorway, caught between the safety of the barn and the sanctuary of the house. Go! Caleb shouted, pushing her forward. She ran, the Winchester clutched in her hands as bullets whistled around her. One shot came so close it tugged at her skirt, but she kept moving, reaching the kitchen door just as Caleb burst from the barn behind her. He was halfway across the yard when his leg went out from under him. The bullet had creased his thigh, not deep enough to be fatal, but enough to send him sprawling in the dirt. Through the haze of pain, he could see Tom Jessup riding toward him, gun drawn and ready to finish the job. From the house came the sharp crack of a rifle. Jessup's horse reared, and the outlaw fought to control his mount as the Winchester spoke again. This time, one of his men toppled from the saddle, clutching his chest. Loretta stood in the kitchen doorway, working the rifle's action with mechanical precision, her face set with deadly determination. Thomas's rifle had indeed never missed what it was aimed at, and in her hands it was speaking with lethal authority. "Move!" she called to Caleb, laying down, covering fire as he struggled to his feet. He limped toward the house, his legs screaming with every step. Behind him, he could hear the Jessups regrouping, Tom's voice raised in fury as he organized another assault. They'd bought themselves a few minutes, maybe less. Inside the house, Wade was already pulling up the trapdoor that led to the root cellar. The space below was dark and cramped, but it represented their only hope of escape. "Can you make it?" Loretta asked, looking at the blood seeping through Caleb's pants leg. "I'll make it," he said through gritted teeth. "Question is, will that tunnel still be passable? Only one way to find out." As they descended into the cellar, Caleb could hear the Jessups preparing for their final assault. Shouts, the sound of running feet, the distinctive click of weapons being readied. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see another sunrise. Behind them, Sundown Ridge was about to become a battlefield, and in the darkness of the tunnel ahead, their only hope lay in reaching the creek before Tom Jessup realized where they'd gone. The tunnel was worse than Caleb had feared. 20 feet in, they encountered a partial cave-in where tree roots had grown through the ceiling, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through mud and debris. His wounded leg screamed with every movement, and behind them, the sound of gunfire from the house told him the Jessups had discovered their escape route. "How much farther?" Wade whispered, his federal marshal's dignity abandoned in the cramped darkness. "Maybe 50 yards, Loretta replied, her voice muffled by the close walls. "If the tunnel hasn't collapsed completely." They pressed forward, guided only by the faint movement of air that suggested an opening ahead. Caleb's leg was going numb, and he could feel warm blood pooling in his boot, but he kept moving. Behind him, Klein's was breathing hard, clearly not built for this kind of desperate flight. The tunnel opened suddenly into the old storm cellar, a stone-lined chamber that Thomas Vale had built during the Apache troubles years earlier. Weak sunlight filtered down through gaps in the wooden door above, and Caleb could hear the distant sound of the creek. "Wait," Marshal Wade said as Loretta reached for the cellar door. "Let me check what's up there." He climbed the stone steps carefully, listening at the door before easing it open just a crack. After a moment, he signaled for the others to follow. They emerged into the grove of cottonwoods by the creek, the same spot where Caleb and Loretta had found the spring just days earlier. It felt like a lifetime ago. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees, and the sound of gunfire from the ranch seemed unnaturally loud in the peaceful setting. "Now what?" Morrison asked, checking his weapons. "We're on foot, outnumbered, and they'll figure out where we went soon enough." Wade pulled something from his Coata Silver Star badge that caught the light, but it wasn't his marshal's badge. This one was different, older, with markings that Caleb recognized from his days running with the wrong crowds. "Texas Ranger," Wade said quietly. "Been working undercover for 3 years, tracking federal corruption in the territorial courts." "What?" Klein stepped forward, his face going pale. "You're not a federal marshal." "Oh, I'm that too. But my real job was to trace the money behind the bounty increases, the fixed trials, the bought judges." Wade's eyes fixed on Klein's with cold intensity. "Funny thing about corruption, there's always a paper trail if you know where to look." "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Abilene bank job that Mitchell's accused of. The one where a federal agent supposedly died. Turns out that agent was on your payroll, helping to move stolen cattle money through territorial accounts." Wade smiled grimly. Amazing what a man will confess to when he's facing a hangman's noose. Caleb felt the world shifting around him. "You're saying the charges were manufactured to give certain people leverage over you. Someone wanted Caleb Mitchell working for them, and they were willing to frame him for murder to make it happen." "But why?" Loretta asked. "Why go to all that trouble?" Because Mitchell has something they need: a reputation for violence that could be used to control other people. Fear is a powerful tool in the wrong hands. The sound of horses crashing through the underbrush interrupted the revelation. Tom Jessup and two of his men burst into the clearing, guns drawn and murder in their eyes. "Well, well," Jessup said, his scarred face splitting in a predatory grin. "Looks like the fox ran himself right into a trap." "Jessup," Wade said, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon, "you're interfering with federal business." "Federal business?" Jessup laughed. "Last I heard, you were just another marshal with a warrant, but that bounty on Mitchell's head says dead or alive, and I'm thinking dead is a lot less trouble." "The bounty's been withdrawn," Wade said firmly. "Mitchell's been cleared of all charges." "Got paperwork to prove that?" Wade's silence was answer enough. Even if what he said was true, it would take weeks for the information to reach every bounty hunter in the territory. "Didn't think so," Jessup said. "Boys, take the marshal and the others alive if you can, but Mitchell, he's been running long enough." The clearing erupted in gunfire. Wade and Morrison dove for cover behind the stone cellar door, while Klein scrambled toward the creek bank. Caleb pushed Loretta behind a large cottonwood and drew his gun, the familiar weight of it feeling both comfortable and terrible in his hand. Thomas's Winchester cracked from behind the tree, and one of Jessup's men spun and fell. Loretta worked the action smoothly, her face set with deadly concentration as she searched for her next target. "Behind you," she called to Caleb. He spun to see a fourth rider approaching from the creek, gun blazing. Caleb's Colt spoke twice, fast and sure, and the man toppled from his saddle into the shallow water. But the fight was far from over. Through the trees, he could see more riders approaching the rest of the Jessup gang, drawn by the sound of gunfire. In minutes, they'd be completely surrounded, and all the revelations about corrupt federal agents wouldn't matter if they were all dead. "Wade," Caleb called, "how many more are coming?" "Too many," the ranger replied, snapping off a shot at Tom Jessup. "We need to reach higher ground." The creek bank rose sharply to the east, offering both cover and a defensive position. But to reach it, they'd have to cross 30 yards of open ground under the guns of professional killers. It was going to be a very long afternoon. The fight for the creek bank turned into a deadly game of advance and retreat. Caleb and the others moved from tree to tree, using the cottonwoods for cover, while the Jessup gang tried to flank them from both sides. His wounded leg was stiffening, making each movement a test of will, but he kept firing, kept moving, drawing on skills he'd hoped never to use again. Loretta stayed close beside him, the Winchester speaking with deadly precision. She'd grown up on the frontier, learned to shoot almost before she could walk, and it showed in the calm way she picked her targets and made every shot count. "How many shells you got left?" Caleb asked during a brief lull in the firing. "6, she replied, ejecting a spent cartridge. "You?" "4. Wade and Morrison were holding the left flank, while Klein's cowered behind a fallen log, his expensive clothes torn and muddy. The rancher had lost all his arrogance now, reduced to what he really was, frightened man who'd gotten in over his head. "Mitchell," Tom Jessup's voice echoed across the clearing, "you're just delaying the inevitable. Give yourself up, and maybe I let the woman live." "Go to hell, Jessup," Caleb called back. A new sound reached them through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching horses, many of them. Caleb's heart sank, thinking the Jessups had called for reinforcements. But the riders who burst into the clearing weren't outlaws. They wore the blue uniforms of the territorial cavalry, led by a young lieutenant whose face was grim with purpose. Behind him rode a dozen troopers, their carbines ready for action. "This is Lieutenant Harris, Territorial Cavalry," the officer called out. "Lay down your weapons." Tom Jessup wheeled his horse, suddenly finding himself caught between two forces. "This ain't army business, Lieutenant." "Murder and kidnapping on territorial land makes it army business," Harris replied. "You have 10 seconds to surrender." For a moment, the clearing was silent, except for the nervous shifting of horses and the distant sound of the creek. Then Tom Jessup made his choice, spurring his horse toward the trees while drawing his gun. The cavalrymen opened fire in a disciplined volley. Jessup's horse went down hard, pinning the outlaw beneath its weight. His surviving men tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, the fight was over. As the dust settled, Lieutenant Harris dismounted and approached the group by the creek. His young face was serious but respectful as he looked from Wade to Caleb. "Marshal Wade, I presume? We received your telegraph about the situation here." Wade emerged from behind cover, showing his badge. "Lieutenant, glad you could make it. We came as soon as we got word about the federal investigation." Harris's eyes fixed on Caleb. "Mr. Mitchell, I have orders to escort you to territorial headquarters for questioning." "What kind of questioning?" Loretta asked, stepping protectively closer to Caleb. Wade pulled out a thick envelope from his coat. "The kind that comes with a full federal pardon," he said, breaking the official seal. "Just came through on the telegraph this morning. All charges dropped, record expunged." Caleb stared at the document, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. After 6 years of running, of looking over his shoulder, of living with the weight of accusations he couldn't disprove, it was over. "The agent who supposedly died in your escape," Wade continued, "turns out he faked his death and fled to Mexico with a considerable amount of federal money. We found him last month, very much alive and very willing to testify about who paid him to frame you." "Klein's," Caleb said, looking at the rancher who was now under guard by 2 troopers. "Among others. This goes all the way to Washington. Mitchell, you were never supposed to be caught. You were supposed to be controlled. A wanted man with your reputation, desperate enough to do anything to stay free." Loretta took the pardoning papers from Caleb's numb fingers, reading them carefully. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears. "It's real," she whispered. "You're free." "Free," Caleb repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. "There will still be paperwork," Lieutenant Harris said. "Testimony to give, statements to sign. But yes, sir, you're a free man." As the cavalry prepared to escort their prisoners back to town, Caleb found himself alone with Loretta by the creek. The water bubbled peacefully over the rocks, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred on its banks. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who'd stood by him when she learned the truth, who'd fought beside him when death seemed certain, who'd never wavered in her courage even when everything seemed hopeless. "Now," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something he'd been carrying for 6 years, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "I ask you a question I should have asked weeks ago." He dropped to one knee beside the spring where her late husband had once proposed, where their own story had begun to take shape. "Loretta Vale," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Will you marry me?" The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Caleb Mitchell Rye, or whoever you want to be. Yes." In the distance, the cavalry was preparing to leave. But here by the spring, 2 people who'd found each other in the midst of chaos were planning a future neither had dared to imagine. 6 months later, Caleb stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun rise over land that was finally, truly theirs. The eastern pasture stretched green and peaceful in the morning light, cattle grazing contentedly near the creek that had been at the center of so much conflict. The boundary markers stood exactly where Thomas Vale had placed them years ago, their legitimacy confirmed by 3 separate surveys and a territorial court ruling that had stripped the Kleins of everything they'd stolen. The sound of laughter drew his attention to the yard, where Loretta was hanging laundry on the line. But she wasn't alone. 3 children from neighboring ranches sat on the porch steps, reading from books she'd given them. The school she'd dreamed of was still just a plan sketched out on paper, but learning was already happening here, one child at a time. "Mr. Caleb," called out young Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson, "Miss Loretta says you used to live in Kansas. Did you really see buffalo herds?" "I did," Caleb replied, settling into the chair he'd built from oak cut on their own land. "Herds so big they covered the horizon like a brown sea." "Tell us about them," pleaded Sarah Patterson, a serious-faced girl of 8, whose parents had sent her to learn letters and numbers. As Caleb spun tales of the frontier for eager young ears, Loretta smiled and continued with her work. The simple gold band on her finger caught the morning light knot, the elaborate ring she'd worn as Thomas's wife, but something new, chosen together from the jeweler in the territorial capital when they'd traveled there for the trials. The trials. That had been an experience neither of them would forget. Caleb had testified for 3 days, his words helping to unravel a conspiracy that reached from local corruption all the way to Washington. Marcus Kleins was serving 20 years in the territorial prison, his ranch and assets sold to pay restitution to the families he'd cheated. The fake surveyor Hutchins had fled to California, but warrants followed him there. Most importantly, the cloud that had hung over Caleb's name for 6 years was finally gone. The newspapers had carried the story, "Innocent man framed by corrupt official sand," while some people would always whisper, the official record was clear. Caleb Mitchell was not the outlaw they'd painted him to be. "Breakfast is ready," Loretta called, and the children scrambled toward the kitchen with the enthusiasm of young appetites. She'd taken to feeding any child whose parents sent them for lessons, claiming that empty stomachs made poor students. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits. Caleb had expanded the room over the winter, adding space for a proper table that could seat 8 comfortably. They were expecting company today, Marshal Wade, who'd become a friend during the long process of clearing Caleb's name, and his wife, who was coming to discuss plans for the school. "Any word from the Territorial Education Office?" Caleb asked, settling into his chair. "They approved our application," Loretta said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "We'll have funding for a teacher's salary and basic supplies. All we need now is to build the schoolhouse." Caleb smiled, thinking about the lumber he'd ordered from the mill in Denver, the careful plans they'd drawn up together for a one-room school that could serve 20 children. It would sit on the hill overlooking the creek, where students could see the whole valley spread out below them. After breakfast, while Loretta worked with the children on their letters, Caleb walked out to check on the cattle. The herd had grown over the winter good breeding stock, purchased with the money the territorial government had paid as compensation for the years of harassment they'd endured. The ranch was profitable now, stable in a way it had never been when Loretta was fighting the battle alone. Near the spring, he found the spot where he'd buried his gun 6 months ago. The earth had settled, grass had grown over it, and nothing marked the grave of his violent past except his own memory. Sometimes he thought about digging it up, keeping the weapon as a reminder of how far he'd come. But most days, like today, he was content to let it stay buried. "Caleb," Loretta's voice carried across the pasture, "Wade's here." He walked back toward the house, where the marshal was dismounting from a fine bay horse. Wade had been promoted after the corruption investigation, given charge of cleaning up the territorial court system, a job that suited his methodical nature. "Henry," Caleb said, extending his hand. "Good to see you. And you, my friend. You're looking well. Marriage agrees with you. Can't complain." They talked for a while about the ongoing trials, about Wade's new assignment, about the changes coming to the territory as it moved toward statehood. But eventually, the conversation turned to the future. "Ever think about taking a badge yourself?" Wade asked. "Territory could use good men who understand both sides of the law." Caleb glanced toward the house, where Loretta was teaching a child to write his name in careful letters. "I've got everything I need right here," he said. "The badge-wearing days are behind me." "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind—" That evening, after the children had gone home and Wade had ridden back to town, Caleb and Loretta sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was a ritual they'd developed, this quiet time together after the day's work was done. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The excitement, the adventure." "What kind of excitement?" "Moving from place to place, never knowing what tomorrow might bring." Caleb considered the question seriously. "I thought I did for a while, but I was confusing excitement with fear, adventure with running away from things I didn't want to face. And now I know the difference between existing and living." He reached over and took her hand. the simple gold bands on their fingers catching the starlight. I spent 6 years just trying to survive each day. Now I'm building something that will last. A coyote called from the hills, its voice lonely but not threatening. In the distance, they could see lights from the neighboring ranches, families settling in for the night. This was what they'd fought, for not just land or water rights, but the chance to be part of something larger than themselves. "I love you, Loretta Mitchell," Caleb said, still getting used to the sound of their shared name. "I love you too," she replied. "All of you, the man you were, the man you are, and the man you're becoming." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and dreams. But here, on the porch of their ranch, two people who'd found each other in the midst of chaos, planned for tomorrows that stretched bright and full of promise into the future. The man who'd once been known as Caleb Rye was finally home.